Lotfullah, we'll start. It's an honor to talk to you. I've been reading about you, and I have to say that you're nothing but short of an inspiration. You have at a very young age, you have seen a lot more than most investigative, or war journalists have seen. You've seen more crises than anyone can sort of process, and you're right now in the US, right? And you're a fellow at the Chicago University.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I wish I was there in person.
Yeah.
I was there in 2018, and it was fun, I must say. Yes, I live in Canada actually. I ended my fellowship, finished my fellowship with the University of Chicago. So now I live in Toronto.
Okay, right. So it's going to be 1 year since life was appended for you. I wanted to, but before we go into what 1 year has been for you in Afghanistan, and what you've been through and what your country is at, I wanted to actually start from the very beginning when you were born in post Soviet invasion, when the country was in civil war, and you were always on the move. Can you talk a little bit about the early, when about the time when you were growing up, you were always on the move? What was that like?
Well, I was born during the Soviet or pro-Soviet communist regime in Afghanistan. I must say, in the last years of it. And when I was growing up, it was basically civil war in Afghanistan in the late 80s and early 90s in particular, that I remember that we had to leave Kabul and then be on the run for a number of years, going from Kabul to south to north. So it was that's what I remember, that we had to travel from one place to another because civil war was so widespread across the country. But thankfully things changed after 9/11 in Afghanistan. 9/11 itself was a tragic incident, but the consequences for Afghanistan was that the country was, we felt at the time, that was liberated from darkness, and things changed, and that was when I think our lives changed as well.
But before you sort of, before the US enters the picture, you were growing up, and these were extremely hard conditions where I read somewhere that you would, while going to school, would see, you saw dead bodies at one time. It was a common sight to sort of process this kind of, death around you. And I wanted to ask you, as a, what effect did this have on you? This being born in this in the civil war kind of situation, and this kind of seeing this hardship and pain.
I think Afghanistan has been going through a lot in the past 40 plus years, and centered around conflict and war. And anyone living in Afghanistan was somehow involved or part of it. So the incident that you're referring to was in Mazar-e-Sharif when I was, I think, a third or fourth grade at the school, when the Taliban attacked Mazar in '96 and a subsequent year, where they suffered a lot of casualties. And then we were going to school next day, seeing hundreds of dead bodies on the way to school. So unfortunately, that never stopped in our lives. And now, in the past few months, I live overseas, I'm reflecting as well on what has really happened in Afghanistan, not just in the past 20 years, but
Right.
before that as well.
Sorry, we lost you in the last few seconds there. But you're processing not just the last 1 year, but all that sort of all the accumulated sort of experiences that you've had. So at the age of 17, you become a journalist, and this is when you were talking about this liberated feeling that had sort of set in post the U.S. invasion. Um, what, how did you enter the profession? I read that there were journalists in the family, but tell us about how you entered the profession. And
I
yeah.
think it started with family-owned small newspapers and university newspapers, as well as a local newspaper that I was helping with designing and initially and later writing for them. I think that's how I started my journalistic career, and then initially we thought it was going to be fun and easy, but I later realized that somehow I got myself involved in one of probably the most controversial careers or
Yes.
industries that I could imagine. But that was
So
too late.
what will be fascinating, because we're beaming you live in Jaipur, Rajasthan, where there's lots and lots of students here, journalism students, and they'll take inspiration by this remarkable journey that you have. You entered the profession at 17, and at 24, you turn out to be heading the largest news network in Afghanistan. And I think in I don't know of a single journalist who's gone from being a designer to becoming the biggest editor in chief of a so tell us how that happens, and what was it like being so young and heading a full blown TV news network?
I After the newspaper experience in Mazar-e-Sharif in the north, I went to work for another newspaper owned and operated by the international forces in Afghanistan. So they sent me to different provinces, and I was still quite young, and that gave me an experience of what was life like in different parts of the country. And I had to write a lot for them for 3 years, and then
Could
I
you,
joined.
sorry to, could you talk a little bit about those reporting years before you became sort of this editor in chief? What was it like?
So those reporting years included 2 years of experience in a province called Baghlan in northern Afghanistan, where I was covering stories basically for this newspaper. And then they sent me to another province just north of Kabul for another year. And then I somehow got introduced to Moby Group, the parent company of Tolo News. Tolo News didn't exist back then. And I started my job as an online editor for them. And quite soon, I think next year, we launched Tolo News. So they put a lot of responsibility on my shoulder, and I was happy to be part of it. And I think that kept me busy until early 2022.
Right. And you were 24 when you headed the news operation, right? I read somewhere that shortly after you sort of took charge, there were many moments where you would have to, sort of sleep within the compound of the news network, where your offices were, just for the security, of not just you but your family. I want to know what toll it had on you, family life, and was your family uh, sort of how did they come to terms with this kind of an arrangement for you? Yeah.
Well, after 2015, when the Taliban
Yes.
designated us as a military target, things really changed for worse for us. We had to put a lot of security measures, limit our movements, use armored vehicles, travel with armed guards. Not so pleasant for journalists, especially at that relatively young age, and that somehow affected not just our family life but also our professional life as well. There were days that you could not go home, and I must say I've missed a lot of good moments with my family. And I think I was telling my wife the other day that I haven't spent this much of time with my parents for many years that I have spent, that I'm spending now. So I'm quite happy when it comes to that.
You're making up for lost time. Yeah, yeah.
Right,
But
but it was, I must say, so after the Taliban threat,
yeah.
that they labeled two TV channels in Afghanistan, their family members included, all their employees and their family members included as military targets. Basically, they could kill anyone, and they did. Within 100 days after
Yes.
they issued that statement, they killed 7 of my colleagues in a car bomb.
So this is 2015, which is a pretty traumatic year because you and another news channel break this massive news that shakes Afghanistan about, um, Taliban fighters entering a girls' school hostel and going on a rampage and what was it like? Because you were not just dealing with the Taliban, but you were also dealing with, warlords and chieftains, and it's a rough territory with many sort of, you know, unsavory characters. How can you tell us a little bit about that story that you guys did, and then the kind of threats that you were suddenly facing was not just coming from one way.
Um, when Kunduz fell for the first time uh, into the Taliban hands, there were reports about misbehavior and abuse of human rights. And Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others also basically confirmed reports that the Taliban abused women or people affiliated to the Taliban. And given Afghanistan's culture, it was quite difficult to get some of these women to speak on camera. But our journalists on the ground were pretty confident that this had happened. Of course, the Taliban didn't like it. They killed people afterwards, and but that was what happened, in Kunduz, based on the reports that we had. We were also, as you said, dealing with so many other factors and actors and players in Afghanistan who were not necessarily media friendly. So was the government, I must say. We didn't have a very media friendly government. So we were dealing with a lot of bad folks. I assume that's what we had got, left and right. So Afghanistan had the freest media in the region for a very long time, but it was not an easy country to be a journalist. We were also one of the deadliest countries for journalists. We have lost over 100 journalists in Afghanistan in the past 20 years. And that's, I think, a very bold number.
2016 seems to be a particularly hard year for Tolo, when if I read right, that you were reporting a news about an attack on a vehicle, and you realized after reporting it that it were your own journalists that had been slain. What was that period like for you, and what, as sort of as a news presenter, to process all that pain and anguish while doing your job? What was it like now when you think about it?
I think definitely one of the darkest moments and in my life. And that evening, I can't really forget. It was a winter evening. It was relatively cold, and I think a lot of my colleagues who were killed, are still. Well, I can't forget their faces. And over the years, to be honest with you, I got to know them more from their family, their parents, and talking to their friends, that we had lost such amazing souls.
It's so sad, and it's just the relentless pace of a news network, while it's not just tragedy happening all around you, but hitting close to home. How does a news organization work in this kind of loss, and this kind of sort of pain? How does it? What do you do to keep going on?
It was a very critical moment for us to really decide whether we should go forward and move on, or we should just shut down and try to do something else. I think it was the overwhelming majority of hundreds of people who used to work for Moby Group to decide that they wanted to continue. I think that was the right decision. And At the end of the day, we were dealing with similar sad incidents, and casualties and killings and bombings and all of that on daily basis. I don't think I remember a day in my 15 plus years of journalism experience, particularly the decade plus of experience at Tolo News, that that we had a day that we didn't have security incidents being involved, or people were not killed. 100 people on average were dying in Afghanistan a day in the recent years.
Let's cut to 2021. When do you get a sense that things are changing? When do you realize that um, the Taliban takeover is imminent? And when and how what was the newsroom's response in those days till the siege of Kabul?
The return of the Taliban to power was understandable, was expected after the U.S. started talking to the Taliban in 2018, 2019.
Right.
2021 was when people lost faith in the peace process, and the Taliban made military advances on the ground, and ultimately they took over the country militarily. And that's why we have some of the issues right now, because they don't think that their power was a result of a diplomatic or a political engagement or a political settlement. So covering the peace process, I think in the early months and years, 2018, 2019, part of 2020 was something that we thought might change Afghanistan for good. But then thanks to so many bad players in the room, I think it didn't go anywhere. And for us, we had that literally became probably half or more of our coverage, of our daily coverage. We had teams in Doha, in different provinces covering the fighting from the peace perspective. Also in Washington as well as in Kabul.
Right. And so when you become aware that the city is going to be taken siege, and when do you start thinking or negotiating your own exit, because you know that it's going to if you can talk a little bit about that time, when and what was the status of the newsroom at that time,
Well, I left Kabul on the 14th for work. I went to Uzbekistan, and we wanted to set up a mini bureau there, or a large bureau actually. We wanted to take hundreds of people with their families to Uzbekistan. And Kabul fell on the 15th of August. So I was basically stuck there.
Right.
I wish I was in Kabul. I wish I was late for that trip by a day. And so I was stuck there, and things changed. And I haven't returned to Afghanistan since then. But I'm sure I will. So I didn't know on the morning of 14th of August, when I boarded that plane to Tashkent, that Kabul airport will be in the hands of the Taliban in 24 hours.
Wow. And you were also sort of, I'm sure you were, as the head of the news network, fielding a whole lot of sort of concerns from your team on the ground, and it must have been harrowing to sort of to guide them and to also make sense of what was happening. Right?
Yes, we had journalists and colleagues throughout the country as well as in Kabul, and some of them stayed in the country and many left. So they are now all over the world. And we are actually trying to put them back to work, including myself. So we're working on setting up a new initiative or a media platform. So and because there's so many Afghan journalists who have left the country,
right,
and because there are so many good Afghan journalists who are still in the country, so how to connect to.
So this news sort of network that you're doing is trying. How do you see yourself going back? How would you work with this newsroom, this dynamic newsroom where you have journalists from within and outside, and
I think it's difficult. It's difficult to be fully based in the country because we know what Afghan journalists have been going through. The UN just issued a statement, a report actually last week, saying that nearly 200 Afghan journalists have been harassed, tortured, beaten, arrested by the Taliban in the past year or less than a year. And this is unprecedented. So hopefully that stops. We tell them to stop it, and we urge them to stop it, and we talk to them about it. I think because so many Afghan journalists are overseas and they want to keep involved and stay engaged in Afghanistan or on Afghanistan, we have to come up with initiatives that embraces them or include them, as well as so they can work with journalists who are in the field, who are inside the country, and some of them are young, probably as young as I was when I started my journey. So they need mentorship, they need help, they need to learn from now this experience of 2 decades of journalism that we have. And we didn't have it 15 years ago when we started. So we're lucky that we have this experience now that can be shared with journalists on the ground. I think that is what our initiative is about, and connecting journalists, Afghan journalists overseas with those inside the country.
My final question, Abdullah, is that it's going to be almost 1 year since the Taliban took hold of the country. We know that the country stares at a massive humanitarian crisis. Could you give us a sense of the sense that you're getting? Where is the country at? And in interviews, you seem very optimistic still. And so I wanted you to give us a sense of, what are the next few years going to be like for the country?
Well, if I don't see a future for Afghanistan, then there is no point for me waking up at 5 a.m. and talking to you about Afghanistan. So I feel quite passionate about Afghanistan, and I feel quite enthusiastic that we as Afghans should do everything we can to make a difference. The situation on the ground is very tragic, and for that reason we have to work harder to make a difference. Right now it's some sort of a stalemate, a political stalemate in the country, and the Taliban, I think, are having a hard time coming up with a vision of how they want to rule the country or run the country. I think they are still struggling to adjust from an insurgency to a government. So I must say, to very bluntly, that the status quo can't last long. Right. So there must be a political process that all Afghans come together and begin a political process to accommodate all Afghans into whatever future we agree upon.
Right. I'll just check with the audience if they have any questions. Okay, there's one lady that she wants to. Could you also introduce yourself, please?
Hello, Lotfullah. This is Jairaj Singh. I'm the news editor, National Newsroom for the Exile. And last time I had the privilege of visiting you, actually, on stage at Top Journalism. So my question basically is a hypothetical one, wherein I am asking you to imagine the day when Afghanistan rises from ashes and blood, and there's this young chap who walks up to you and says, I want to be a journalist. What would you tell him? Because since this is an era of conflict and a lot of tragedies and a lot of blood and tears, and he walks up to you and says, can I be a journalist? What would be your answer to him?
You might remind
sure.
me the question. I couldn't hear it properly.
Okay, sure. So I think the lady's asking that would you, if a young journalist approaches you and say, or somebody young wants to be a journalist in Afghanistan and says that should I go ahead, and you knowing the risks and the toll it has taken on the community, would you be encouraging and would you say go ahead and probe the truth, or would you caution them and say that look, find a safer profession, basically?
I wish there was a safer profession. I think it's a noble cause and job to go and tell the stories of your people to the world. I would definitely encourage any young Afghan journalist, For the same matter, Indian journalists
Right.
to be passionate about this industry, this profession, and keep telling the amazing stories of our part of the world to the rest of the world. I think Afghanistan is still a place where there are so many untold stories.
One more question. Just one question more. When we are reporting in areas of conflict, if I'm audible to you, so is there a legal or a financial kind of a security that you give to your team, especially in such sensitive and vulnerable areas where your life is at risk and such a lot of risk that every day, you really have to wear your net and walk in report. So is there a legal backup that is there or a financial security that you provide? Or do you stand with the reporters in times of crisis, which you said every day there's a crisis?
So I think the question is that at Tolo, could you provide your reporters, people working in the field, any kind of cover, security cover, legal, financial, knowing that they were risking their lives day to day, and what is the framework essentially for reporters in a in a place where there's turmoil.
Well, I mean, as you know, I'm no longer involved with Tolo News, but I think for the journalists that I'm working with right now, I think it's important to make sure they stay safe, first of all, and they're paid because the media market financially is shrinking. And when it comes to legal protection, I think the question is how to basically make sure they are not arrested and beaten and tortured by the Taliban. I don't think you can just sue the Taliban and then take them to the International Criminals Court. You just have to learn how to operate and stay safe. But there are initiatives. I think Afghan journalists are many of them who have left the country are finally coming back together with initiatives to build on what they had achieved for so long. And part of that, hopefully, should or will involve or include engaging with the Taliban when it comes to protection and safety of journalists.
Dr. It was a pleasure speaking with you. It was an honor, I think, for everybody here to hear you, to feel inspired by you. And I think your Twitter handle, your bio says journalist, location Kabul. I think that's where your heart is very much. And I hope that you go back and continue to do all the good work. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Bye. Thanks. Bye.